History is often as fascinating as it is uncomfortable, but when we dig into the oldest texts, especially the Old Testament, we find a world where women's lives were anything but just. So why don't we talk about it more? Today, it is time to question, analyze, and truly look at how women were treated in a comprehensive manner according to these ancient writings. We must begin by setting the scene. The Old Testament was written during a time of tribes struggling for survival, and its social structure was heavily shaped by patriarchal norms. Women had very little empowerment, and many of the rules governing their lives were established in religious texts. Take this example. In Genesis 3:16, after Eve ate the forbidden fruit, God says to her, "Your husband shall rule over you." The passage not only sets the tone for the Old Testament, but for the entire condition of women in that world. Women's lives revolved around men, and the law was not on their side. Women were often seen as the property of their fathers and husbands. They had limited rights to inheritance, and their value was often measured by their relationship to men. If a woman became a widow or childless, her existence could become extremely vulnerable. In the books of Moses, we see examples of how women had to fight to retain property or gain legal recognition. But this is just the beginning. We must dive deeper to understand how the laws themselves shaped this subordination and, in how many cases, violence and discrimination were sanctioned. So what does it mean that our woman in the Old Testament? In short, legally not much for women. Women's rights were limited, and they were often regarded as second-class citizens. A clear example is inheritance rights. In most cases, women could not inherit land or property in the same way as their male relatives. However, there is a story about the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers 27, who asked to inherit their father's property because he had no sons. After much hesitation, God granted their request, but only on the condition that they marry within their own tribe. An example of perhaps fairness, but under very strict conditions. Marriage in the Old Testament was not a romantic affair. Women were often regarded as part of the man's property. In Exodus 21, it is described how a father could sell his daughter as a servant, which says something about women's low status. A woman who was married off was expected to obey her husband, and infidelity could lead to the death penalty, especially for women. All of this points to a system where women had very little control over their lives. Their worth was measured in terms of obedience and their relationship to their husbands. To understand the extent, we must also look at what happened when women broke societal norms, which often led to violence. Violence against women in the Old Testament was not just prevalent, it was institutionalized in a way that was both shocking and unpleasant. Some of these stories are hard to hear, but it is important to understand them. One of the most brutal stories is found in the book of Judges, chapter 19. Imagine this: a Levite travels with his concubine. When they seek shelter in a city, they are surrounded by men who demand to hand over the Levite. But what happens? The Levite sends out his wife to save himself. She is raped and abused all night. In the morning, she lies dying at the threshold. The Levite takes her body home, dismembers her into 12 parts, and sends them to the 12 tribes of Israel. Why? To take revenge, to incite home and gathering. But what happened to her? A woman's life was reduced to a symbol in men's power games. This is not an isolated story. It reflects a world where women's lives were disposable, where violence against them was part of power games and power structures. And this was not an exception. It was often the norm there. Understanding the violence against women in the Old Testament is crucial to understanding the society shaped by these texts. It reminds us of a time when women not only lacked their own voice, and their lives often lay in the hands of men. When we talk about control and power over women's lives in the Old Testament, it is impossible to ignore the purity laws that directly governed their bodies and actions. These laws affected everything from their social status to their participation in religious rituals. So what are we talking about here? According to Leviticus 15, women are considered unclean during their menstruation. Yes, unclean. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they were not allowed to participate in religious ceremonies, and that anyone who touched them became unclean. They were to be isolated, and their return to purity involved a ritual that includes washing and offerings. This is not just about purity laws, this is about quick control. Women's bodies literally became symbols of impurity, something that needed to be purified before they could be reintegrated into society. It reminds us of how women's status is often reduced to their biology, and how that biology became a source of social shame. It does not end there. Women's reproductive role was another crucial factor. In Genesis 30, we see stories of Rachel and Leah competing to bear children for Jacob. The ability to bear children granted status and social value, but infertility was seen as a shame and a failure. It was a system where women were defined and often controlled by their abilities or failures to reproduce. So here we have it. Women controlled by religious laws and social norms, where their bodies and roles were reproduced as symbols of purity, impurity, and social value. But there were even more ways in which their role in society was limited. Let's talk about marriage and family life. For if there was anything that defined a woman in the Old Testament, it was her relationships with men. As a wife, daughter, and mother, these relationships were rarely equal. Women were regarded as men's property, and marriage was an economic and social union. A woman was handed over from her father to her husband, and was expected to submit to him. In Deuteronomy 22, for example, rules regarding women's chastity before marriage are described. If a woman could not prove her chastity, she could be stoned to death. Yes, you heard right. It's about life or death, all depending on a man's accusation. A woman's primary role in marriage was to bear children, especially sons. Inability to bear children could lead to her being cast aside or mistreated. Her entire value lay in this ability. And many women were forced to live under this ceaseless, unrelenting pressure. Women's sexuality was strictly controlled. Infidelity could lead to the death penalty for women, while men had greater freedom. In Numbers 5, there is a ceremony where a suspected unfaithful woman would undergo a trial where the priest mixed a drink that, if she was guilty, would cause a curse. Here, we clearly see how women's lives literally depended on the faith or distrust of the men around them. Thus, we see a society where women were not only legally or religiously subordinate, but also socially and sexually controlled. But what happened when women broke these norms? Violence and oppression were the response, which leads us to the next part. When we talk about legal protection for women in the Old Testament, it is important to realize that it is often very limited. Instead of protecting women from violence, the law in many cases could reinforce or even sanction the violence. Take Deuteronomy 22, again, where it states that if a man rapes an unmarried woman, he must marry her, and he can never divorce her. So let me clarify, the rapist would marry his victim. Is this protection? For the woman, it meant living with an abuser for the rest of her life, without an escape route. And then we have the story of Lot, Genesis 19, where he offers his daughters to the men of the city to protect his guests. It is yet another example of women reduced to mere objects and victims for men's purposes. This was a world where women's bodies and lives were used as bargaining chips, and the law was not there to protect them, rather to uphold men's power. This is a part of history that is rarely discussed, but is crucial for understanding the historical context. Understanding this is not just about looking at history. Therefore, it is the root of many of the patriarchal norms we still struggle with. Women deserve more than just invisible victims in silence. And as mentioned, there is much more to analyze. Have you ever thought about which voices we hear in historical narratives? In the Old Testament, women's voices are almost always silent. When they do appear, it is rarely in the first person, and their lives are often told through a man's perspective. What does that mean for our understanding of women's status in these texts? Let us take the story of Sarah, Abraham's wife, who is mentioned in the book of Genesis. She was forced to fight against her husband's sister and was given to other men to protect Abraham. Her faith, her feelings, and her voice fade into the background, while the story centers around Abraham's life and decisions. Women are often used as symbolic objects. When King Saul in the first book of Samuel promises his daughter as a reward to whoever kills Goliath, we see how women's lives are reduced to a bargaining chip in men's power games. It is not about women's own desires or lives. It is merely a tool in a larger game. Women like Bathsheba, Tamar, and many others appear for brief moments, often in connection with tragedy or conflict, before their story falls silent, as you are forced to act in your context, to be a victim, an object of male desire or shame. It is important to understand that this invisibility was part of the system that kept women subordinate. Their stories were lost in the shadow of men's stories, and their suffering became a backdrop to others' achievements and power struggles. But are there no examples of women breaking out of this invisibility? Yes, there are a few, but their stories are as complex as they are rare. Despite this predominantly practical structure, are there any women in the Old Testament who take up space? They break the pattern of power into their own hands, even though it often comes at the cost of great personal risks. Let us take a closer look at these exceptions and what it says about the world they lived in. Deborah was an excellent example. She was one of the few female judges in Israel who led her people to victory against the Canaanites. In the book of Judges 4 and 5, we see a woman who is not only a leader but also a prophet. Deborah is one of the few women who was treated with respect and power. But why is she so rare? Why does her story go against the prevailing norm? Another woman who stands out is Queen Esther. Her stories are both fascinating and tragic. Esther risked her life to save her people from extermination. By using her position at the king's side and her courage, She managed to change the course of history. But at the same time, her stories remind us of how women often had to navigate within strict patriarchal structures to make a difference. These women are admirable, but their stories also show how extremely much was required for a woman to gain power, achieve power, and influence. It was not a given, but something that had to be fought for in a world that rarely saw them as equals. Deborah and Esther are exceptions, not the rule. Their existence says as much about women's oppression as it does about their courage and strength. For every strong woman we see in the text, there are countless others who are silenced, forgotten, or sacrificed. But how have these stories shaped the world and been interpreted by later generations? And how much do they still influence the perception of women in religious and cultural contexts? It is easy to think that the Old Testament is just old texts, distant from our time. But the truth is that it has influenced generation after generation of believers and shaped cultural norms, even today. What does it mean for women and equality? Vain Barris for woman and home equality. The texts of the Old Testament are used as the basis for religious teachings and traditions in both Judaism and Christianity. In many cases, women's roles and status have been described in these texts, reinforced by cultural practices. Traditional gender roles have been justified by referring to their writings. Women's freedoms have often been restricted because of this. In some traditional Jewish interpretations, women's roles have been strongly linked to the home and family, often referencing the texts of the Old Testament. Even in Christianity, some churches have used these texts to justify women's subordination and exclusion from leadership. At the same time, there has been a movement to reinterpret and understand these texts in a new way. Feminist theologies have sought to find strength in the text, highlight female role models, and challenge patriarchal interpretations. This is an ongoing struggle to change the perception of women. As a reminder of how deeply rooted these stories still are, what we see in the Old Testament is not just a historical relic. It is the foundation for generations' views on women. A foundation that must be examined and questioned, for it is only when we understand where these norms come from that we can begin to change them. So how do we move forward with this knowledge? We must continue to explore, question, and give a voice to those who were never heard. When we discuss the Old Testament, it is important to look at women's role in religious rituals. In this world where men held the dominant position, women had a limited and sometimes almost non-existent place in religious ceremonies and symbolism. One of the clearest examples of women's subordination in religious matters is that the priesthood was reserved for men. In Leviticus, or in the third book of Moses, priestly rituals and laws are described as being performed exclusively by men. Women were simply not welcome in this sphere. As we mentioned earlier, women's purity was a crucial factor, but it went deeper than menstruation. Childbirth, illness, and other natural biological processes could render women unclean and thus excluded from religious places. They needed to undergo purification ceremonies to become acceptable again in society and in the eyes of religion. But there are some exceptions exist. Women like Deborah mentioned earlier were not only judges but also prophets. Miriam, Moses' sister, was also regarded as a prophet to some extent, but these women were few and constituted exceptions rather than the rule. This shows that there is potential for female authority, but only under very specific circumstances. In summary, women had a very limited role in religious rituals. They were excluded, marginalized, and forced into roles where they could only participate when societal norms for purity were met. And yet another example of how religion shaped women's subordinate status. So what happens when women are used as symbols or role models in prophecies or religious stories? We see both power and vulnerability in the same figure. Women in the Old Testament are used not only as physical persons but also as symbols, and not always in a flattering way. Their role in prophetic stories and allegories can also say a lot about how they were perceived. In many prophetic texts, women's symbols are used for Israel or for other nations when they commit sins. A clear example is found in Hosea, where the prophet takes a prostitute as a wife as a symbol of Israel's unfaithfulness to God. The woman in the story is used as a living allegory for sin and impurity. Prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah often use female metaphors to describe Israel's decline. These images may seem powerful and poetic, but they also reflect the view of women and symbolize sin, impurity, the nation's vulnerability, and it is hard to avoid the thought that these reinforce negative stereotypes about women. Why is this important? Because these symbols are not just stories. They reflected how women were viewed in society. and how their role was diminished to allegories and served men's messages. Women became objects to represent the nation's sins rather than being seen as individuals with rights and intrinsic value. There are also examples of women representing strength and courage, like Judith and Esther, but these stories are often presented in the context of extreme struggle or sacrifice, reminding us how unusual it was for women to be represented as strong without having to undergo great challenges or trials. Using women as symbols may seem powerful, but it also contributes to dehumanizing and reducing them. This is something that persists in many interpretations and cultural expressions even today. By examining these texts from a critical perspective, we can understand more about the structures that still affect us today. The Old Testament is a powerful text, but its power also lies in our ability to reinterpret, question, and use it to create a just world. It has been a long journey, but hopefully we have together opened up for an important dialogue, a dialogue about women's rights, justice, and how we understand our oldest text. Regardless of what you believe in or do not believe in, it is worth examining what has shaped us. So what do you think? Should we reinterpret these texts, or can we anchor them in history? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear what you all have to say. Thank you for following this journey through the darker corners of the Old Testament and the rays of light that were still there. This was not an easy story to tell, but important stories are rarely simple. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you appreciated this kind of in-depth analysis. See you next time. Until then, question, think, and keep being curious. We'll see you in the next video. Peace.